Okay, I want to start with a reality check this morning. And a lot of journalism is actually not national and world events, particularly when you do an internship at a community newspaper or you take an entry-level position at a community newspaper. On a small local newspaper, you will likely be covering local government. And that's not as exciting as events on a larger scale, but it has a lot of advantages. One advantage is that this is a time for you to learn how to apply the basics you've learned and to learn more. If you make mistakes, the mistakes are on a small scale and they're not disastrous to your career. They don't end your career. So it's a good time to practice, a good time to learn more and not be crippled by your mistakes. It is also a ticket to advancement in journalism. You seek out the stories that translate to a larger audience. And also, if your community newspaper posts to the Canadian Press Newswire, as the one in Kamloops does, your story can be picked up across Canada with your byline, and that looks nice in your clipping file. So, working for a local newspaper or local media outlet, you want to watch for local stories that can appeal to a larger audience. Previously, I gave an example of that. A student who did a class assignment for me that was a follow-up story to a small court story about a hamburger thief that turned into a national story with the student and was published in a national magazine. A story like that in a clipping file for a job application in journalism would be gold. 3 stories like that, and you'd probably be on the short list for hiring interview for an entry-level position. Finding and doing stories like that is a matter of smart news values and good interviewing skills. I remember a time that a student of mine, while he was doing courses with us, found his own story to freelance. The story was about students with jobs at the Whistler ski town on the BC coast who are sleeping in their cars. The student freelanced it himself to the Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper, because he was very enterprising and entrepreneurial. Before he did the interview, he asked me for some advice, and I said, be sure to get details on plenty of details about the car the student was sleeping in, what make, how old it was, what color it was, how much he paid for it, how he managed, a day of sleeping and managing in the car. Details like that would bring the story alive. Think of the details that Marie Colvin would put in one of her stories. The student's story was published in the Globe and Mail on page 3, which was a great location. And in my own career, I remember one time I was covering a small municipal council that was passing a routine bylaw requiring dog owners to clean up after their pets. Nothing remarkable about that. But the mayor had a great sense of humor, and he made a series of jokes about asking about what was next, putting diapers on horses and gerbils. I thought it was funny, and I wrote it up as a quirky story. A friend of mine from another newspaper, daily newspaper, covered the same council meeting at the same time. He was very serious about journalism, and he didn't bother to write that story. My editor posted the story about horses and diapers on the Canadian Press Newswire. The story went ballistic. A radio chain in the United States picked it up, and it was broadcast on 50 radio stations in the United States. Meanwhile, the editor of my friend saw the story making waves on the CP wire and berated my friend for not filing the same story. It always hurts the sense of competitive spirit to get beaten at a story you should have had. But my friend told me what had happened with a laugh, and when his first child was born, I gave him a stuffed animal as a present. So the point is, it is possible to find and publish great freelance stories from small locations. Local government is a bizarre world to cover, like reading Kafka. If you've ever read anything by Kafka, you know that the writer describes being in situations where there are strict, unknown, incomprehensible rules. At the same time, there's chaos and random chance. If that sounds incompatible, that's because it is. But that's what covering local government feels like. It can be confusing and disorienting. You expect meetings to be crystal clear with everything explained in context, but it often isn't like that. Sometimes it feels that there are strict, unknown, incomprehensible rules in the midst of chaos and random chance. The members of local government use technical terms that you don't know. They can be thinking in terms of a past history and a context they know, but you don't know. Covering court cases the first time feels the same. You survive in those situations by asking the right questions to get you through this terra incognito. In the past, when I've taken this class on a field trip to a city council meeting, at first the students aren't sure what the most newsworthy story is, what notes to take, what questions to ask, and how names are spelled. So when we get back to the journalism lab from the city council meeting and students start to compare notes, they realize how diverse their points of view were in covering that meeting. But this difficulty in covering local government is an opportunity in journalism. Local government often has the greatest and most immediate impact on citizens, and yet is so complex and so poorly understood by local citizens. So the citizens need the media to interpret and make the complexity understandable. It also takes time for citizens to sit through a 2-hour meeting or to watch it on the local cable TV station. So the citizens need the media to save them time by summarizing a long meeting of local government into a story that gives the essence to read in 10 minutes. So what are some strategies to survive this terra incognita? The first is to have sharp news values and be able to see through the haze in the news value in a story, which isn't always obvious. And I'll return to the issue of news values later in covering local government. Next is understanding the technical issues well, and yet not being limited by the technical issues. What do I mean by that? Well, if city council is passing a new zoning bylaw, that is a technical matter that can have huge consequences. But if you focus purely on the technical matters for the sake of the technicalities, you may lose your audience. The same in court coverage. Some legal technical issues have big consequences. Other legal technical issues are important to the lawyers and to the judge, but not to the audience. And you always remember that you are writing for the audience. Another related issue is who sets the news agenda. A municipal council may think that a technical issue is very important and spends a lot of time discussing that, but you realize that it is not important for the audience. Whereas another issue that the council does not see as very important and spends little time discussing, you realize is very important for the audience. So you cover what you think matters to the audience, and the council thinks you are a bad journalist because you don't agree with the council about what is important. So who sets the news agenda? The council or the journalist thinking of the audience? Sometimes officials seem to have the power to set the news agenda. The police investigate crime and issue a press release. For city council, the council literally sets the council agenda and has a certain control over the flow of information. Often journalists have to rely on these official sources, particularly given the resources of a newsroom. For instance, in cities, the daily newspaper tends to have the most reporters. Proportionally, the radio and TV stations have far fewer reporters. That means that the daily newspaper may be the only media outlet to have a full-time reporter covering courts all the time, or a full-time reporter covering the municipal government all the time. The daily newspaper may have enough reporters to even cover the meetings of municipal committees. And covering municipal committees is a great advantage because you cover an issue before it reaches the council meeting, and likely before it reaches the broadcast media. So the broadcast media likely doesn't have enough reporters to do this. That means that the daily newspaper with more reporters has a better ability to go beyond responding to press releases and set the news agenda for other media. And that is the media ecosystem. The daily newspaper with more reporters dominates the media ecosystem, but everybody is competitive. Depending on the resources of a daily newspaper, the daily may have enough reporters to go beyond press releases and city hall meetings to do its own independent investigation on issues that were otherwise hidden. Again, that is part of the media ecosystem. Once the daily newspaper or the broadcast media breaks an important story, it's absorbed in the media ecosystem and everybody runs after it. But in a place like Kamloops in 2014, the daily newspaper closed after 80 years of publishing and 50 employees were out of work. The cause was attributed to a decline in revenue, but the newspaper had also been losing circulation over the past few years. And what that means is that a newspaper needs to be vigorous and focused energetically on the needs of the community in a way that make the newspaper essential reading. With the closing of the daily newspaper in Kamloops, the local media ecosystem was weakened considerably. The remaining media outlets had a smaller number of reporters and were more reliant on press releases and official sources. So the power in setting the news agenda in those circumstances can swing from the media towards official sources. And now in Kamloops, 8 years later, readers may have forgotten the role that the daily newspaper played in their lives, and eventually a sense of that may vanish. In the same way, I worked for a daily newspaper in Ontario that was exceptional for doing its own independent investigations, some of those investigations international. And it was able to do that because it had a higher than average number of reporters working for the newspaper relative to circulation. But this newspaper was sold while I was working there, and after it had been sold, it was sold again, and the number of reporters was reduced to increase revenue. At that point, the newspaper didn't have enough reporters to do investigations and cut back to the basics. But it still had more reporters in the city than the broadcast media. Sometimes in this issue of who sets the media agenda, you can come across a small story, a story that the council thinks is small, but that blows up. And I'll give an example of that in Kamloops, of a crazy little story that blew up. The story was that the zoning bylaw in Kamloops didn't allow homeowners to keep barnyard animals in their backyards. That sounds sensible. Who wants a neighbor with a donkey or a llama or a rooster next to them in a residential area? Who wants to be woken up on Sunday morning by a donkey braying or a rooster crowing? It sounds like a sensible bylaw, a routine bylaw. But there was a lady in the downtown area of Kamloops that wanted to have 3 chickens to lay fresh eggs for her guests. So she came to fight the zoning bylaw. And it was one of those David and Goliath situations about one human being fighting City Hall over chickens. A story like that grabs attention. The story exploded much more than the council might have expected. Part of the community was pro-hen and part of the community was anti-hen. The council was divided and there were long debates. Then the council passed a motion in a split vote of 6-3 to allow up to 6 hens on smaller residential lots. And it's interesting when you look at the bylaw, look at the details, how specific the details. You can almost imagine a host of a comedy Tonight Show reading out the list on this on air. So just give you some of the details. A maximum of 6 hens are permitted on any residential property in Kamloops. All hens must be at least 4 months old. I mean, who goes around and checks how old the hens are? The keeping of roosters is prohibited. Okay, that might be a bit of a problem in order to get the eggs. A tenant must obtain permission from the property owner to keep hens on the owner's property. The owner must have hens. The owner of the hens must reside on the property where the hens are kept. Applicants must advise their neighbors of their intention to obtain a hen coop permit prior to submitting the application. Hens must be kept in their coops from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Hens must be kept in an enclosed hen run when not in their coop. Hen coops and runs shall be a distance of at least 1.2 meters from the rear lot line and at least 1.2 meters from any side lot line of the dwelling lot on which the coop is located. So quite a list, and there's more items on the list. As a result, one person in Kamloops started a rent a hen business. So it was a small but quirky story. The details are quirky. The media had fun writing the story at length with puns, and even CBC picked up the story. Now note that the council was divided with a split vote, 6-3. So the journalist should set the agenda of what the news is, not members of council and not the lawyers. It is what the journalist thinks matters most to the audience. Technical issues matter if there is an impact on the audience, but reporting technical matters just for the sake of technicalities will lose the audience. Another issue in coverage is often power, politics, and dynamics. This often happens below the surface so that these issues provide context and coherence in a story, but you don't report them explicitly. It is implied by the facts or by the extra knowledge that the audience brings to a story. A small, apparently insignificant detail or event can have a huge importance in terms of context when you're dealing with power, politics, and dynamics. For example, two elected officials can have a bitter argument over something trivial, and it seems strange that the argument over something trivial is so bitter until you know that they have an intense rivalry. For example, now I'll give you another example of what might seem to be a minor detail can have a huge importance in terms of context. And in this example, I'll refer to a piece of clothing. An example I gave previously of the Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci interviewing the Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini. I talked about how they had a bitter conflict during the interview about a piece of clothing, the chador, the traditional covering for Muslim women. For Khomeini, it was an important issue of respect, tradition, and religion. For Fallaci, it was an important issue of freedom from oppression and women's rights. It was also an issue in the interview who would be dominant and claim the moral high ground. But you wouldn't understand the bitterness between Khomeini and Fallaci over a piece of clothing unless you understood the implicit context and unless you understood the power dynamics. So in covering even local government, there are issues of power, politics, and dynamics below the surface. Those issues provide context and coherence to a story, but you don't report them explicitly. In any situation of government or employment, there are power dynamics. For instance, in local government, there is a distinction in power between the administration and the elected officials. The administrative staff are hired and they are employees. They don't make policy decisions. It is their duty to carry out the decisions of the elected officials, whether or not they agree or disagree. As employees, it is an unwritten and in the civil service in Canada, it's an unwritten law in Canada that these civil servants will not even publicly criticize elected officials. As a journalist, that means you would interview administration officials for factual details, but not ask for a comment on a policy decision of the council. The division between administration and elected officials becomes more contentious at a higher level of government, where there are career officials and politicians divided into political parties. The administration officials are expected to transition smoothly from a government under one political party to a government under another political party. But with human beings, it isn't that easy, it isn't that smooth, and there's often hidden opposition in the administration officials, and there may even be sabotage. There's also power dynamics among members of the same political party, even on a local council. In groups, there's often a conflict between preserving the harmony of the group and allowing individuality and dissent. Sometimes people are punished for dissenting and not agreeing with the group. I'll give you 3 examples of what I'm talking about in terms of conflict and power dynamics from my experience of covering small rural townships governments. In the first newspaper I worked for, I covered several small rural township governments at the same time. The head of one of the of a township like this, which is a rural municipality, is called a reeve, not a mayor. In one of the townships I covered, I would often take the time during the day to come into the township office and chat with the clerk to get facts, not opinions. The type of information I couldn't get during the council meeting, particularly since it was at night. The clerk was a nice guy and we got along well. And I realized that he often thought the council was making a mistake, but he couldn't say that. So he sabotaged the council by giving me ideas of what they didn't want revealed. I never identified him as a source, and I was careful at council meetings not to seem friendly to him. The council was probably mystified how I managed to ask what they didn't want discussed. It was a simple version of Deep Throat, the name of the secret source of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein in writing the Watergate story that eventually brought down US President Richard Nixon. In that case, Deep Throat was a high-ranking FBI official disgruntled about being passed over for promotion and concerned about what was happening. There is always somebody on the inside who knows about the secrets. Another time, I was covering another rural municipality. In this case, I realized that the reeve and the clerk had formed a tight allegiance to mislead the council. Most of the council didn't understand that they were being misleaded, and most of the council wanted to preserve the harmony by voting with the reeve, supported by advice from the group. In most groups, preserving harmony is a high value, and that makes it difficult to dissent. Except for this council, there was one dissenting councillor. By dissenting, he made himself popular with the group, but he was a brave person and he had integrity and he spoke out publicly and he talked to the media. The explosive issue was a technicality, a zoning application for a school, a technicality. However, the school was a school for dyslexic boys. Dyslexia is a problem with the brain where letters and numbers get scrambled in a person's mind, and that makes it difficult to spell, read, and do math, and it makes it difficult to learn. For years, dyslexia was not diagnosed, and so children with dyslexia seemed to be lazy and slow learners. The children didn't know why they had a problem, and so they could be resistant and develop strategies for dealing with a problem they didn't understand. As a result, some dyslexics seem to behave like delinquents. And that was what happened in the township zoning for the school for dyslexic boys. The school was portrayed as a school for delinquents. And beginning with opposition to the school on council, that inflamed the community, except for the lone counselor who dissented because he understood what dyslexia was. On the surface, it was a technical issue of zoning with a council with one dissenter. But there was so much conflict over such an interesting story that it got coverage across Ontario. The school eventually closed in 2009. A few years later, there was a class action suit against the school for mistreatment of the children, which resulted in a $4 million court settlement in 2013. My third example comes from another rural municipality. The Reeve had got the council to approve the sudden firing of the clerk, who had worked there 25 years and had widespread support in the community. But there didn't seem to be a logical reason for firing the clerk, and there was one dissenting councillor. The issue of the council firing the clerk became so contentious that it divided the township. The township was on the verge almost of a civil war. There were threats of violence. Children on the school buses mocked each other over sides of the issue. The Reeve had the police come to a council meeting one night when the citizens came to protest quietly with signs. I remember I was there at the council meeting, and at the back of the room, I asked the police sergeant why they came to a peaceful protest, and he couldn't do much more than shrug his shoulders. There was one lone dissenter who lived on an island in a river. Because of the contention, someone came one night and cut the tail off the horses that belonged to the counselor. Also, since the only way from the island to the mainland was by boat, someone pulled the plug out of the bottom of the council member's boat. And when this dissenting counselor started out on the river one night, the boat started to fill with water. There was so much conflict over the issue, the story got coverage across Ontario. So in covering even local government, there are issues of power, politics, and dynamics below the surface. These issues provide context and coherence to a story, but you don't report them explicitly as a journalist because you're trying to maintain a responsible, neutral tone in your reporting. Sometimes the underlying issues are more interesting than what is happening technically, but you can't speculate as the writer on the underlying issues. However, you can interview elected officials and get their comments, and you can state the facts in a way that the audience can read between the lines and understand the implications. In any government situation, you want to watch what succeeds, what raises opposition, what is defeated, and why that happens. If there is total agreement on a council, you report that because that's a significant event. Total agreement. Total agreement could surprise the community, particularly on a contentious issue. In some senses, division on council is healthy, not only for the democratic process, because it represents all the people in the community. Even the people who are in the minority still like to feel they are represented by the members of council that dissent from the group. So total agreement is an interesting development, an interesting circumstance in a council meeting, and it's something you want to report. At the same time, if there is dissent, you report that dissent through quotations and through the record of the divided vote, like the 6-3 vote at Kamloops City Council to allow backyard hens. You ask yourself as a journalist, who holds the power in this situation, and how are the power dynamics handled? You ask yourself, is there legitimate dissent and disagreement? Issues are not always simple black and white situations. Life has ambiguities and contradictions, so it is not easy to make simple decisions when there are contradictions. There are two basic types of local government: the municipal government and the school board. And the course text covers both of these types of government in detail. The text is very practical, down to earth text. What are the main local municipal issues? No, they would be that the local municipal government passes taxation for local property, for residential property, retail property, and industrial property. And people pay attention to their property taxes, their bill. Local government passes bylaws that apply on a municipal level, a specific type of law, which I'll talk more about later. Municipal government talks about property zoning, and that's a huge local issue, which I'll also talk about later. The other typical form of local government is the school board, and school boards have their own taxation rate, separate taxation rate, although it's included in one property tax bill. And the school board taxation rate affects all families with school-age children from kindergarten to grade 12. These are the issues in municipal government and the school board that have a huge impact on local residents. In some ways, the biggest effect on citizens is local government, particularly if you own a home, own a business, or operate an industry, and if you have family with school-age children. Local government probably has the least effect on university students, particularly if university students have moved out of the family home, are renting, and in another community. So if your reference point is as a single person just graduating from university and you get a job in journalism, you may be out of touch with your audience and what impacts your audience. And you need to be in touch with your audience. So local media are heavily invested in issues of local government that have huge impact on local residents. If you start out in a career in journalism, that is likely where you will start reporting and where you will start to build your career. Now, these days, in communities either too small or too dangerous for the media, the coverage comes from untrained citizen journalists. And with the advances in technology, journalism in these places, like Syria, where Marie Colvin was killed, the issues may be covered more and more by citizen journalists. So, for example, in Mexico, citizen journalists cover the dangerous wars between the drug cartels where thousands of people die. Or in a city like Syria in 2013, and remember that Marie Colvin was killed in Syria in 2012, the year before, citizen journalists reported the conflict in a city there when there was no media coverage or no conventional media coverage. Or in Afghanistan in 2011, when US Navy SEALs were on a secret mission to get Osama bin Laden, the first reports about the secret mission in progress came from citizens posting on social media. Or in the terrorist attacks in Mumbai, India in 2008, the first reports of the attacks were done by citizens using social media before journalists and the government were able to issue reports. The media ecology is changing, and the media need to adapt to these changes. I'm going to examine some of these changes in terms of investigative journalism in my course on that topic next fall, because investigative journalism is changing because of the technology and because of the changes in media ecology. Anyway, back to local government. Depending on the size of the local government you work for, you may have the city hall beat or you may have the school board beat. The skills in journalism for these are the same as for larger or national media, but the focus is is local. So let me give you a few tips on on covering council meetings and other meetings. First, journalism is about making sense of the chaos of information. In order to make sense, you need a context, and you need to be able to summarize the diversity and complexity of what is happening in a few accurate words. The situation can be intimidating because it is confusing, unfamiliar, and requires you to bold and get information out of strangers in only a few minutes. In order to gather information efficiently and take notes or photos, you either have to know what is going to happen or assess quickly what is happening in terms and know the meaning of what is happening. The information you need to write the story on local government is either given during the meeting or accessible through sources who are at the meeting and could be interviewed during breaks before, during, and after. And those breaks are invaluable to you because there'll probably be details and issues of context that you don't understand, particularly if you're new to the municipal beat. And so you need to pounce, you need to be prepared and pounce on the breaks, and on the end of the meeting, be fast, get up there, ask your question. In the past, when I've taken this class to municipal council meetings, I've made that point to the students, and I sit and watch what happens. And typically, the students feel more intimidated, and when there's a break or the end of the meeting, they sit in their chair, and you can see the local media jumping up and pouncing and running around and getting the quotations. The radio reporters will run around with their tape recorders, ask some fast questions, get the audio clip that they need. And you can see the local media doing that, where the students feel intimidated and they hold back. But then after doing this for a while, some of the bolder students in the class will set an example by jumping up and pouncing and going out and asking questions. And you hope that the whole class will follow. While the meeting is unfolding, your understanding of what is happening can be unfolding. Of course, you need to read the agenda before the meeting, and these days agendas are online, but often you find yourself in a situation that something unexpectedly unfolds during a council meeting. And so while you're taking notes, part of your brain has to be thinking and analyzing what is happening, what is newsworthy about this story, what are the changes in the direction of the story, what's the most newsworthy angle, what is the concept of what is happening, what are the assumptions underlying what is happening, what are the implications of the decision that's being made, who voted and how and why, and how will the decision affect what happens next. So you can see in what I've described, you're doing two tasks at the same time. First, you're taking notes, and so part of your brain is attending to taking notes. And at the same time, another part of your brain is analyzing the situation and adapting to the situation very quickly. And when I talked about Oriana Fallaci doing her interviews, and I talked about the interviews she did with Ayatollah Khomeini and Muammar Gaddafi, I described a situation where you could see during the interview and the notes that Fallaci wrote afterwards about the interview. You could see how this thinking process that was taking place in Fallaci while she's doing the interview. So sometimes you find yourself as a reporter asking questions, taking notes, and at the same time reserving a part of your brain for analyzing the situation, and for seeing, guiding yourself where you should be going and what you should be understanding. So these tasks individually are simple. Taking notes is fairly simple, although you have to know what's important to take a note of and what's not important enough. Asking questions is a fairly simple process. Analyzing the situation is a fairly simple process. Try combining them together, okay? As a journalist, think of combining these simple processes together at one time. And combining the simple processes together obviously makes reporting more complex. If you don't take accurate notes, if you don't understand the context of the situation, if you don't take advantage of breaks in the meeting to ask elected officials what is happening, get quotes, you may go back to your newsroom, sit down to write your story, and discover that you don't have enough information to write the story. Now, as I mentioned, agenda these days are available online. The Kamloops City Council agenda is online. You can go in anytime and just have a look at it. At times the Kamloops City Council agenda can be over 100 pages and longer. Lots of information for you to digest before you go to the council meeting. Make a decision about what's important and what's not important. In Kamloops, I think you can get the agenda the Friday before a council meeting. The council meetings are on Tuesday at 1 p.m. So it's easy for you to get the agenda ahead of time. And because you have the agenda ahead of time, that also makes it legitimate for you to gather information before the meeting starts so that you can understand the issues better or include the information more in your story. So I found most administrations helpful when you go as a reporter to ask questions on details coming up in the agenda, as long as you've maintained genial relationships. If something hot is coming to council, feel free to write about it before the council meeting. You don't need the permission of council. You don't need to wait until the council meeting to write the story. The agenda has been released. The issues are public. The council does not control the press. So the press want to notify the public in advance of an issue coming up to council to influence the decision and influence the debate and build an audience for the next story. And that particularly happens with ongoing stories. That if a new important issue is coming to council, you want to write what's called an advance on that from the agenda, and you can even dash around and get more details and maybe get elected officials on the record before the council meeting. That depends on the elected officials. Some may not want to comment before it's been discussed at council. Others may feel free to discuss it and be quoted. So you can see how the agenda is very useful to the media and allowing the media to start covering a story before it comes to council. So, the hand bylaw story, in that case, if a journalist had got whiff of it, these days you might get whiff of it from watching Facebook and Twitter and see that the public is talking about somebody coming to council, or you look at the agenda and you see that there's this woman, ratepayer resident, is coming to council to discuss the number of chickens she can keep. You're free to go ahead and interview this person before she comes to council, and take some photos of her and show what a lovely lady she is, and get talk something up that's maybe now already on Facebook and Twitter. And so you write that story, part maybe alerted by the agenda, or maybe alerted by keeping track of Facebook chatter in the community. You're able to write that story before it comes to council and do a fuller job, because you have the freedom to run around and interview people, which is restricted, at the time of council meeting. Particularly if the council meeting is at night, when fewer people. Some people can sometimes be harder to get a hold to, or you have an ongoing story. So the urban hen story in Kamloops was an ongoing story, and between council meetings, you might want to do a story. You might want to go and interview residents in the hen lady's neighborhood and see how they feel about her and about how they feel about having chickens in the neighborhood. Or you might want to write an advance alerting citizens that council will be taking its final vote at the next council meeting. And that gives the residents a chance to let the politicians know how they feel. Whereas if the media isn't covering this, the community may not be aware that a final vote is coming up. The community is blindsided, and they can only react after a decision has been made. So you see in that how the media part of the democratic process in alerting citizens to issues that interest them, and then they can influence the politicians. One rule I suggest is always get to a government meeting or any meeting at least 15 minutes early in order to chat with people. If you time your arrival just at the time of the meeting, you're losing an important opportunity. The opportunity is before the meeting starts, to chat with the people in charge of the meeting and to chat with people in the audience. And you can find out what the issues are going to be, and chatting with people in the audience before the meeting starts, and you might not even be interviewing them. You're just, it's kind of like a social journalism. Once you've chatted with them, after the meeting ends and a decision has been made, they're going to be more comfortable seeing you again and asking, answering your questions. The same for officials. It's always a good idea, polite idea, as a journalist, particularly if you're new, before a meeting starts, to go up and introduce yourself, why you're there, and just so people know who you are and are comfortable with this. I know as a court reporter, I always used to do that in court. I would for sure always introduce myself to the defense attorney, even if I wasn't going to interview the defense attorney, just to let the defense attorney know that I was in the audience. It gives the defense attorney a heads up that the story is going to be covered. That's kind of a diplomatic thing to do. And also later on, in a break or the end of the court case, since the defense attorney knows who you are, he or she will probably be more comfortable answering your questions. And as a matter of course, I would do the same with the prosecution, although usually in Canada, the prosecution does not want to be interviewed, and you respect that. In the United States, it's very different culture, very different media culture, and so circumstances are different. But in Canada, prosecutors tend to be more conservative with the media and not wanting to give interviews. But it's still a good courtesy to introduce yourself to the prosecution. I know sometimes I'd be sitting in a court case, and the judge would stop the case and would actually ask who I was and what I was doing there, and I would just be polite and I would say, well, I'm a journalist for such and such newspaper, and I'm covering it. Thank you, Your Honor. So just getting to a meeting early or talking to people during a break is good. If you're covering an official meeting, a council meeting, one of the things I would suggest you do when you get there early is make a seating plan in your notebook. And so usually the council is situated in a desk that faces the public gallery, and often they have nameplates in front of them. At council, you're dealing with 9 elected officials. The regional district government here, Thompson-Nicola Regional District, has many more members, and they sit in a circle, which means half of the, some of them have their backs to you. Now, I said make a seating plan. That is a name of each person, elected official who's sitting in front of you, and like I said, the district government, actually those who are sitting behind you, because when the discussion gets going and you have to take notes quickly, you have to note who is saying what. And if you're totally new to council, like Kamloops Council, if you're totally new to a council, 9 members, it may be difficult for you to remember who is talking while you're taking notes at the same time. If you have a seating plan, what I would advise you to do is you write their names in, and you have initials so that you can put initial Arjun Singh, AS. So Arjun Singh, a city council, says something, you put quotation, you put RS, and you don't have to write the name. And your seating plan helps you identify very quickly who is talking. Also, when there is a vote, you want to record with the numbers of vote, and in some cases you want to record who votes for and who votes against. And if you're doing it and you're new to council, so you went to Kamloops City Council for the first time, and there's a 6-3 split vote on the urban hen bylaw, the vote is going to be fast. It's going to be all A's or yeses, all nays or no, and that can happen very quickly, and you just don't have time to write down everybody's name. So what I advise, and what I used to do, okay, is I had my seating plan, and usually you expect that the nay votes are going to be less than the yay votes, and that doesn't necessarily happen all the time. But anyway, if I'd been covering the urban hen bylaw, and when the vote came, I would have my seating plan, and all the nay votes, I would just put an X beside each name. Then I would know who voted nay, and those who I didn't mark would be the yay vote, unless there was somebody abstaining, and you record that as well. So anyway, that's a little trick, a little strategy one of those series of little tricks and little strategies you develop as a journalist to help you cope with these situations. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult for you afterwards to reconstruct who said what and what the split vote was in a council meeting.